The wind had no mercy that day. It sliced through coats and ribs alike, whispering cruelty through the cracks of a broken town that had long since stopped pretending it had a heart. Men stood in loose circles outside the saloon booths, buried in half-melted snow breath, fogging in clouds. They weren't here for whiskey or weather talk. They were here for the auction. No cattle, no horses, just a woman and her child. She stood on the wood-planked platform like a worn-out painting, faded, frayed, and too familiar to be valued. Her hair, once copper-bright, now clung damp to her neck, matted from sleet. Her cheeks were wind-scoured, her shawl barely holding together at the seams. But it was her eyes, dull, defiant, and tired, that betrayed the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Beside her, a boy no more than 5 held her hand with fierce desperation. His coat was 2 sizes too big and patched with old feed sacks. His lips had gone a little blue. He didn't cry, but his eyes searched the crowd as if begging someone, anyone, to stop what was happening. The man who'd put them their pace like he owned the world. Her husband in name only, thick-bodied, red-nosed, and slick with ale. He waved his hand at the crowd and barked something like a laugh. "She's still got all her teeth, boys. And look, you get the brat for free." Laughter cracked through the crowd, sharp and hollow. Some men spat into the snow. Others looked away, not out of shame, but boredom. They'd seen this before, plenty of men tired of their wives trading them for coin whiskey, or sometimes just to settle a bet. "Come on," the auctioneer drawled, stepping up with his hat tipped back and his voice like gravel. "Starting bids $1. Silence. The woman didn't flinch. Not when they laughed. Not when the wind lifted her skirt hem to show her worn boots. Not even when a voice from the crowd muttered, "She ran once, I heard." "Got caught in the next county. $1, the auctioneer repeated. "Anyone. No hands, no bids." The child tugged at his mother's sleeve. She didn't look down. She stood straight, shoulders square, like a condemned prisoner who decided she would not kneel. $50. The auctioneer tried again, his tone more irritated now than amused. Still nothing. "God damn it, she's worth more than firewood." The husband shoved her forward, but she caught her balance. Still no flinch. She just stared past them toward the street where the wind kicked up dust and sleet in lazy circles. That's when he moved. From the back. From the shadow between the blacksmith's awning and the old church post. A man, alone. He stepped into view without sound, his boots pressing deep into the slush. He wore a long dark coat and a felt hat pulled low. His face was half shadowed, but his eyes were visible gray, as river stones and just as unreadable. The auctioneer blinked. "You bid in." "Stranger." The man didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a crumpled envelope, and handed it to the auctioneer. Then he looked at the woman, not with pity, not with hunger, just recognition. The auctioneer opened the envelope, scanned its contents, and let out a low whistle. "Hell, you're serious." He stepped aside. "Sold." The husband shouted something foul, but the sheriff, who had been leaning lazy against a post all along, straightened and took a step forward. Just enough for the husband to bite his tongue and spit in the snow instead. The stranger didn't touch her, didn't offer a hand. He just nodded once slow. She looked at him, eyes narrowed like she was trying to see through fog. He turned. She followed. No words were exchanged, not one. The child paused and glanced back at the platform where his toy horse had fallen. He started to run for it, but the mother caught him gently and picked it up herself. They disappeared into the falling snow, the boy bundled in her arms, her boots crunching behind the man who'd just bought them without a single spoken word. It was nearly dark by the time they reached the cabin. Nestled between 2 frozen ridges, it looked like a secret buried in winter. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. The porch creaked beneath their weight, but the door opened without a groan. Inside, it smelled of cedar and bread. A kettle hissed softly over the fire. The man pointed to a chair, then to the hearth. She walked forward unsure and sat the child down beside the flames. Then he left the room. Her fingers trembled as she removed the boy's boots. His toes were white but not frozen. She wrapped them in an old shawl and held them close to her body. He curled into her, whispering something she didn't quite catch. When the man returned, he carried a bowl of stew and a spoon carved from cherry wood. He set them down on the table without comment and lit a lantern on the wall. Warmth settled in the room like a silent agreement. She fed her boy, slowly blowing on each spoonful. Her hands were cracked red from cold. The man sat in the corner, sharpening a knife, not watching her, not ignoring her, just existing quietly beside her. And maybe that was the strangest kindness of all. When the child began to nod off, she wrapped him in both their blankets and laid him near the fire. The man rose and pointed toward a second room. For you, his gesture said. She walked to the threshold. Inside was a simple cot, a basin of clean water, a stack of quilts folded like someone had been waiting for her all along. She turned back suddenly unsure. Her voice when it came was hoarse from disuse. Why'd you do it? The man paused in the act of dousing the lamp. Then in a voice low and sure, he answered. Didn't sit right. The way folks looked at you, he didn't say more. Didn't have to. Later, as she lay in the strange bed with her son curled beside her, she stared at the ceiling watching the shadows dance. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. She should have cried. She didn't. Instead, she listened to the wind outside, now muffled by logs and glass and fire. And for the first time in years, it didn't sound like it was coming to take her. It sounded like it was passing by. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she barely remembered, and held her boy tight. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, for the first time in too long, it didn't feel like the end of something. The days that followed passed without ceremony, stitched together by silent snow, and the subtle sound of healing that doesn't announce itself. He never asked her name. She never offered it. In the mornings, she'd wake before dawn, brush the child's hair, and build the fire he always left prepared. The matches were kept in a jar by the hearth, dry and ready. She'd learn the small patterns of the house quickly, where the floorboards creaked, which cupboards stuck, how the kettle whistled before it boiled. These weren't lessons of necessity. They were her way of earning air. The child spoke more freely than she did, though even he knew not to be loud. He watched the man with a curiosity that flickered behind his eyes like candlelight. He asked questions in whispers, questions that made her flinch, things like, is he going to make you cry, or are we going to have to leave again? The man never answered those. But he always looked up when the boy asked. And then slowly he'd return to chopping firewood, mending boots or whatever quiet task he'd taken up that day. He was not cruel. He was not soft either. He was something rarer, ill. She studied him in pieces, shoulders shaped by labor hands marked by splinters and calluses, a jaw, set not in judgment but restraint. He never raised his voice. He never hovered near. But he was there, always there. On the fourth morning, she found a wooden spoon on the table, small, delicate, carved with a sun at the handle's end, the kind of thing no one had time for anymore. She picked it up like it might shatter. The man glanced over from the stove. For the boy, he said it simply, then stirred the pot of oats without waiting for a thank you. That night, as the fire danced shadows across the floor, she dared ask her first question. Did you have a wife? The question hovered in the air, unbalanced. He sat in his chair, rolling tobacco slowly between his fingers. Had. She'd die, he nodded, how he paused. Then soft as smoke, winter fever. Year before last. There was a quiet so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. She didn't speak again, but she remembered the look in his eyes, how they didn't fill with tears, just shadows. Later, while tucking the boy in, she traced her fingers over the spoon's sun carving and whispered to the sleeping child, not everyone wants something from us, but even she didn't believe it fully yet. The next day, she caught her reflection in the cabin's wash basin. Her cheek still bore a fading bruise, a ghost of hands she had tried to forget. Her lip had a healing crack. She dabbed it with water, then lifted the boy's shirt to check his ribs. They weren't bruised anymore, just thin. That night when the man returned from the barn, he found the cabin swept, dishes stacked, and the smell of bread hanging in the air. He looked around once, then nodded. Nodded her, not even toward her, but as if the cabin itself had started to breathe again. It was the first time he smiled. Not wide, not bright, but a real smile, the kind that curled just enough to make her wonder what his laughter might sound like if he ever let it out. She sat across from him that evening, both of them with mugs of tea. He asked no questions. She answered none. But the fire burned between them like a third presence, safe, patient listening. The boy had started leaving his drawings on the man's work table, crude stick figures, horses with square legs, house with smoke always rising. One afternoon, the man pinned one to the wall above his desk, said nothing about it. When she noticed, she didn't comment, but her shoulders dropped just slightly, like a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying finally slipped. The weather turned mean again near the week's end. Ice crusted the porch. Snow hissed at the shutout. She was folding laundry when the man returned with blood on his hand. Not a lot, just a gash across the palm, raw and pink and stubborn. She dropped the shirt she was folding. Sit, she said, and it surprised them both how firm it sounded. He did. She brought a tin of sal from the cupboard, water in a bowl, and a rag she warmed near the fire. As she cleaned the cut, their eyes met closer than they'd ever allowed. His face didn't twitch even as she pressed the rag to his skin. He smelled of hay leather and a trace of pine. She stitched the wound with quiet care, her hands steady despite the quiver in her chest. "You're good at this," he said, voice low. She tied the last knot learned the hard way. That was all. She cleaned up without another word, but her hands shook just once as she poured the bloodied water into the snow outside. That night she stayed by the fire after the boy had gone to sleep. He stayed too. Neither of them acknowledged the nearness, but they didn't move away either. When the fire dipped low, he asked her name. She told him. Then softly she asked his. He told her. And just like that, they were no longer strangers. By the next morning, the way she stirred the porridge felt different. The way he set her tea beside her instead of on the counter did too. Not romance, not yet, but something more honest. On the 10th day, the storekeeper's widow arrived in a sleigh with supplies. She looked around the cabin and raised her brows. "Looks brighter in here." Neither of them replied, but the child ran to her and hugged her knees, which said more than either adult could. The woman handed the man a parcel and leaned in close to the heroine. "Don't waste time wondering why you were chosen. Sometimes the ones that don't shout are the ones listening best." Before leaving, she gave the child a peppermint and winked. The boy tucked it into a jar with two others he hadn't eaten yet. She watched him, her heart nodding. He was saving sweetness. He didn't trust it would last. That night, the man left a single book on her pillow, a poetry collection. Old spine-cracked pages annotated in a neat hand. She opened to the page he had marked. "Not all storms come to break you. Some come to clear your path." Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not until later when no one could hear. Then came the moment that changed everything. A knock at the door, hard, unfriendly. The man opened it, cautious. It was a writer, tall, lean, cold-eyed, not from town. Not familiar, said he was looking for a woman and a boy, said they were his. The man didn't let him in. Just stepped outside, shut the door behind him. Their voices murmured in low tones. Heated, then gone. When he came back and his face was unreadable. "Who was that?" she asked, voice thin. "Doesn't matter," he said. But he sat by the fire that night, longer than usual, knife in hand, sharpening it slowly, like the sound could keep whatever danger had passed from coming back. And she, for the first time since arriving, locked the door. The silence between them that night was not cold. It was heavy, protective, alive. She went to bed but couldn't sleep. The wind outside rattled the eaves, but the boy breathed steady beside her. Eventually she rose, walked to the hearth, and found him still there as if waiting for her. She sat beside him, and without asking, without needing to explain, she took his hand and held it. Fingers interlocked, warm, real. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because sometimes the deepest truths are spoken in silence, and sometimes the people we belong to are the ones who let us be quiet long enough to hear ourselves again. Spring came slow that year, as if the land itself feared what might bloom after such a long silence. Snow thawed reluctantly, melting into gray puddles that laced the prairie like bruises. The ground softened underfoot, releasing the scent of old roots and promises buried deep. Inside the cabin, change moved more swiftly. She had started with little things, a ribbon stitched into the curtain, hem a sprig of dried lavender tucked into the folds of a quilt, a patch mended on the elbow of his work shirt that she didn't ask permission for. Her hands, once used only for shielding and caring, had learned how to shape peace, and in the shaping she was learning her own worth. The man noticed. Not all at once, but in the way he lingered longer at the table after meals, in the way he'd rest his hand briefly on the back of her chair before stepping outside. He didn't speak of it. He didn't name it. But she could feel it in the air between them. Charged, careful warming. The boy had taken to following him around the pasture, asking about everything. Why fences had to be mended, why nails rusted, why birds always flew west in the evening. The man answered what he could, and when he didn't know, he admitted it. The boy began calling him sir at first, then mister, then nothing at all. He just tugged his coat and asked his questions. One afternoon, while turning soil for planting, the man glanced at the child and said softly, "You want to put a seed in the ground. You got to believe something will come up from it." The boy looked at him as if he'd just spoken scripture. The woman heard it too from the porch, where she was beating dust from a rug. And for a moment she had to sit down and close her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her son. Not even close. Later, she began drawing a map. Not on paper, but in the house itself. A threadbare tablecloth she'd once hidden from shame now graced the table without apology. A tin mug with a bent handle found new life as a wildflower vase. An apron stitched from 3 different dresses hung on a peg beside the fire, always smelling faintly of rosemary and smoke. She hadn't just moved in. She'd made the house speak again. And the man who had once lived like silence was safer than grief began to listen. There were small rituals now. He'd bring in kindling before dawn. She'd leave him a slice of cornbread on the windowsill. The child would leave 2 pine cones in the boots by the door. One for luck, one for tomorrow. But there was something else beneath it all. Something unsaid. Not fear exactly, but something like waiting. It came back in pieces. In dreams. In wind that scraped the roof at night. The memory of the man who had once owned her. He hadn't returned since that day the writer came, but his shadow lingered in the woman's thoughts. She watched the road more often now. She flinched when voices rose at the general store. She checked the lock at night twice, sometimes 3 times. The man never asked why. But one morning she found a rifle newly oiled by the hearth. Not loaded, not meant for show, just ready. And next to it a second cradle. Not for her son, a new one. Small, empty. She stared at it for a long time. Her fingers traced the curves, the gentle carved arcs in the wood. Then she looked down at her own stomach. No swelling. No child, but the thought had come to him, or maybe the hope. Or maybe just a belief that life had a right to keep going. That night she dared ask a question she never thought she'd voice. "Do you regret bringing us here?" He didn't answer at first. Just stoked the fire with measured care. Then still facing the flames, he said, "I regret not doing it sooner." She didn't cry. She thought she might, but something stronger took root. A kind of quiet awe. One afternoon she heard laughter, real, full-bodied sunlight, thick coming from the barn. Her son had tried to lasso a fence post and tripped backward into a hay pile. The man had seen it and laughed, hands on his knees, eyes crinkled, warmth echoing through wood and sky. She froze on the porch holding a bucket of fresh water and just listened. She hadn't heard that sound since her own father died, and somehow it made her knees tremble. But joy was always brief, wasn't it? The letter arrived 2 days later, folded into thirds, pinned to the door with a rusty nail. No name, no wax seal, just a paper scar on the front of the cabin. She saw it first, pulled it down with shaking hands. Inside were 5 words. "I'm coming for what's mine." She didn't tell the man, not at first. She buried the letter under the floorboard by the hearth beneath the patch of loose wood she'd always meant to fix. That night she made stew with extra potatoes, folded the laundry tight, and kissed her son's head 3 times instead of 2. But silence is a weight. And the man noticed. After supper, he set down his cup and simply asked, "What happened?" She didn't want to speak it aloud, but she opened the floorboard and handed him the folded letter. His hand didn't shake as he read it. His jaw didn't clench. He simply folded it again and put it in his coat pocket. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We stay, but if he comes, he'll be met." There was no anger in his voice, no threat. Just the same quiet strength he'd shown since the day he bought her, for no reason other than he couldn't stand the sight of cruelty. She looked at him then, not as a stranger, not even as a rescuer, but as a man she might someday love. Not for saving her, but for giving her the space to save herself. The next morning she didn't wait to be asked. She took the boy's hand and led him to the creek while the sun still cut gold across the fields. She showed him how to watch for trout shadows, how to know if a snapping twig meant squirrel or something worse. She taught him how to pack a sack with food, and Flint how to move without sound. She was not afraid. She was preparing. The man watched from the ridge unseen. Later, when the boy slept, she sat on the porch step and spoke. "I'm not running again, I know. If he comes, he won't take you." They didn't speak more, but the wind passed through the trees that night like a lullaby sung in an old tongue, and something inside her eased. The next day, the storekeeper's widow arrived again. She brought seeds, corn, beans, tomatoes. They all worked together to turn the soil, even the boy with his too small shovel and serious face. By sundown, the garden was planted rows upon rows of possibility. As the man washed the dirt from his hands, the woman handed him a cloth and said, "You're not what I expected." He met her eyes. "Neither are you." And then at last there was laughter soft shared. That night she sat with her diary. She wrote, "I was sold like nothing. Then I was seen. Then I was still. Now I am home." But the next dawn brought something unexpected. A horse's cry. One rider at the edge of the field, not approaching, just watching. The woman stepped onto the porch, hands clenched. The man followed, said nothing. The rider turned his horse after a long moment and disappeared into the trees. Not today, but maybe soon. The man placed a single nail on the porch rail, silver heavy, and beside it the rifle. She nodded once, then turned back to the house. She had bread to bake, blankets to mend, and heaven to protect. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day where the wind was quiet and the sun sat soft in the sky, as if the land itself didn't want to make a sound. She had just laid the fresh linens out on the line, her hands smelling of lavender and ash, when she heard the distant rhythm. Hooves, steady, deliberate, coming up the south trail, not a neighbor, not a passing rider, no one from town. She didn't call for the man. She didn't move. Just turned slowly, brushing her skirt clean, as if facing down a ghost should come with dignity. The rider came into view just past the split rail fence. It was him, her husband, the man who once sold her like a rusted pan, the man who left bruises like fingerprints and laughed when the boy cried for help. He hadn't changed much, still broad-shouldered, still wearing that same battered hat, but something in his face had soured further, like milk too long forgotten. His eyes searched the yard, landing on her, then the house, then the child's toys beside the porch step. He dismounted without a word. Behind her, the screen door opened with a creak. She felt the presence before she turned. The man who had given her shelter, who never once asked her to be anything but still and safe. He stood quietly, rifle in hand, held low but sure. The husband's lip curled. "You got comfortable." She didn't answer. He looked at the man beside her and spat in the dirt. "You think buying what's mine makes her yours?" The rifle didn't rise, but the man's voice came low and certain. "She ain't yours." "Not ever. I married her. You sold her." The wind shifted. A crow called out once and fell silent. "She's coming with me," the husband said. "And the boy, blood's blood." "No," she said. Just that, one word. A steel line drawn across years of silence. He stepped forward. "You don't get to say that. I do now. You think this man loves you. Think he'll keep you when you're used up, when you break." The man moved forward then, not fast, not angry, just forward. He stepped down from the porch, boots steady on the dirt. "You need to leave." The husband laughed, bitter. "You think you can scare me? No." The man glanced toward the barn. "But I didn't come alone." At first, the husband didn't understand. Then the sound came, a second set of hooves. From the far trail, the sheriff rode up. Behind him, the storekeeper's widow in a wagon, eyes sharp as flint. The husband's face twisted. "This your idea of law?" The sheriff dismounted, hat low. "Saw you toss that girl like scrap in front of half the town. I ain't here to argue. I'm here to make sure you ride out." "I'll be back," the husband hissed. But even he heard the hollowness in it. "You do," the sheriff said, voice flat. "And I bury you." The man never raised the rifle. Never had to. The husband spat one more time, kicked at the ground, and climbed back on his horse. "You'll regret this," he said to her, voice cracking. "I was the only one ever gave a damn about you." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Just said no. "You were the reason I forgot what peace felt like." He left. The trail swallowed him without a sound. The sheriff nodded once, then followed. The storekeeper gave her a small, proud smile before turning her wagon back toward town. Silence fell. The man turned to her, waiting. Not touching her, not assuming. She looked at him, her face unreadable, and said, "You didn't shoot." "Didn't have to. I wanted you to." He blinked slow. "Would've, if I needed to." The words landed like warmth after frost. Inside, the boy peeked through the window, face pale, eyes wide. She beckoned him out. He ran to her arms and pressed his face to her waist. "You safe," she whispered into his hair. "We're safe now." That night, the air was clearer than it had been in months. The stars hung low, sharp enough to cut. She sat beside the fire diary, open ink drying slow. He came. But this time I didn't run. This time someone stood beside me, and this time I stayed. She turned to find the man standing in the doorway, watching her. "You still scared?" he asked. "Yes," she said without shame, but not of him. He tilted his head. Then what of believing this might last? He walked forward slow, sat beside her, took her hand. His voice came soft. "I ain't asking you to believe everything. Just believe me." She looked at their joined hands. "Why? Because you made this place into something worth keeping." She breathed once deep. Let it fill her. And when he leaned forward, forehead against hers, neither of them needed to say what was already known. That love wasn't born in grand words or kisses stolen under moonlight. It was made in the quiet in days spent rebuilding in hands that didn't hurt in a man who stood still while the world shook and waited until she chose to reach for him in a woman who'd once been sold and now finally had chosen to stay. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a song. And inside that little cabin, two people sat shoulder to shoulder while a boy slept warm in the next room, the cradle beside him, painted with her hand carved by his. The fire crackled and their silence held no fear, only peace, and the kind of quiet that meant everything had finally blessedly begun. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.